Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 14th of November 2023. I am somewhat drained today. Not only did I do 4 ATP videos, but I did a 2-hour live chat with my good friend Dr. Aaron Adair on ancient phonetics on my other channel, and biblical exegesis and history and archaeology and whatever else we could talk about. So a little bit tired today. Sorry if I'm a bit off colour. Okay, let's go to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to the video below. And we have a somewhat similar data yesterday by point of fact that there are some categories that are relatively low, given what we've seen for the last month. But then there is personnel figures of 920 losses, which is at the upper end of the range. So things are tough for at least the Russians on the front line. It's not to say that Ukrainians aren't suffering large casualty numbers as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. So 920 Russian losses, 8 tanks, 7 APVs. That's fairly average losses, although, 8 tanks in one day is significant. Yeah, it's kind of odd that you look at losing 8 tanks and think, well, that's quite low. And as I always say, if the British lost 8 tanks in one day, it would be an absolute disaster. 7 APVs, as I say, 20 artillery systems, fairly heavy losses. Well, very heavy losses, really. But I guess we're spoiled if you're pro-Ukrainian by point of fact that we've seen 50 losses on certain days previously. So 20 doesn't seem like a huge number, but it is a huge number of artillery losses. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 15 drones, it's not from last night before, 24 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 2 pieces of special equipment. So logistics still being hit quite hard. But yeah, the story this tells us is it's still tough in a number of places on the front line. I've seen an awful lot of drone footage of a vast number of personnel being taken out by drones. Just a lot of drones doing. It might be here and there, dropping an IED that's taking out 1 person, hitting a vehicle that's maybe taking out 5 people, but there's just so many of these incidents that you put them together. And you develop a kind of understanding that not only is there going to be shelling and small arms fire and mines, anti-tank mines and missiles and long distance drones doing their thing, but there are these IED and FPV drones that are just being used en masse, and that makes a massive difference. Right, we're going to look at Andrew Perpetua's loss stats as far as what he's found in his surveying of social media sites to find out video footage and imagery of these losses, and again we see what is that, a 5-to-1 loss ratio, Russian to Ukrainian losses, something like that. The stats are really in favor of the Ukrainians yet again. Let's look at what the Ukrainians have lost. A couple of tanks, undefined tanks there, so obviously hit so much or destroyed so much you can't really tell. All the footage is low resolution. And then a Bradley ATGM taking that out, but not sure if it's a new one or not. And then a Humvee, a similar outcome for that. So not particularly high value equipment, just a few bits and pieces. We go to look at the Russians, quite a lot of ISW, intelligence surveillance, and not ISW, ISR, intelligence surveillance reconnaissance. And we know that the Ukrainians are trying really hard to hammer those and electronic warfare installations to give them, particularly in the Kherson region, an advantage as they are attacking there. And then artillery, quite a few bits of artillery, some Muster S's, some Yatsin, the old D20, then a multiple launch rocket system or 2 there. And yeah, so that's fairly high value losses. That's going to hurt the Russians. A few tanks, T-80, T-72. And an unknown, some BMP, some infantry fighting vehicles, pretty standard. And then you can see a lot of trucks and civilian vehicles being used by the military, indicating that the Russian logistics are still being hammered at on a consistent basis. So again, really a large number of losses for the Russians that is going to be hurting them and relatively low losses for the Ukrainians. I don't know if this, I mean, we know that, as I've talked to you before, these lists skew towards drone losses, but we also appear to be seeing an advantage that Ukrainians have in terms of the number of bits of kit that the Russians lose to drones compared to the number of bits of kit that the Ukrainians. Now, we know the Ukrainians are still losing stuff, that the Russians they do have that capability in terms of using first-person view drones and using Lancets and things like that. But I just don't think they have the scale that the Ukrainians have. When you look at the numbers of drones that are being provided to the front lines for the Ukrainians, given United 24 Army of Drones initiatives, things like that, the huge amounts of money, and then the scale of units raising money for their own drones independently, you see an awful lot of that happening, and you wonder. Well, I don't just wonder. I'm pretty certain that just isn't happening to the same scale with the Russians. So they both have the same kind of capabilities. It's just that the Ukrainians have this capacity of FPV drones that far outstrip, and IED dropping drones that far outstrips the Russian capacity. And I think that makes something like this list look like the way it does. Right. There has been an article in the Euromaidan press. Well, actually, there it's referring to an Economist article that talks about American officials estimating 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers having died in this war, and up to 120,000 have been more seriously wounded. And that is a high number, probably higher than a lot of pro-Ukrainians would like, that they have probably been thinking. According to the analytical article, this led to a shortage of male workers. So it talks about not only just the death stats per se, but the effects that has had on the Ukrainian labor force and the economy, and then the ramifications in terms of female workers and female soldiers being drafted in to do these jobs. So interesting analysis there. You can go and read it in full by clicking on the link in the description below, because the first couple of segments of my first video of the day always have the links to these below. So go and check that out. But yeah, high stats for the Ukrainians as well. Right, a group of Russian infantry decided to hide from a first-person view drone. I showed you this yesterday in one of my videos that wasn't my lost video, so it's later. Was it a frontline video, or no? It was my extra, and I just wanted to show you that. But it's worth noting that this kind of stuff happens in terms of like trying to build up a picture for losses. This kind of stuff happens on a daily basis, and there's been this evolution of drone capability and usage throughout the war. So what happens here, I can't really show you, but basically you get about 5 people hanging around this old destroyed APC, and they obviously, get knowledge of a drone in the area and sort of rush inside and get inside to hide from the drone. But then the drone literally flies up to the APC, really quite slowly as well, and drives in the side door to it. And there's kind of no escaping. It's this. I was just posting this to show how able drones are now to do things that they just weren't able to do, say, 10, 15 years ago. We have a drone. You just saw it there. There it is there. It just very slowly flies in there where you got 5 people hiding, flies in there, and it just explodes. And it's quite a big explosion considering the side of the drone, and you're thinking they're not getting out there without a serious headache. So the fact that these drones can fly through windows, fly through hatches, fly through doors means that there isn't often escaping. There's a bit of a viral bit of footage that's gone out this morning. I haven't put it on today's feed or today's video, but there's a car with 2 Russians in, at least 2 Russians in, and they're driving down an empty highway away from a drone that's chasing them. Then they can't see it, and then they stop. They say, right, we need to do a UE. There's a bridge back there. So stop, do a UE, drive, and then you got this dash cam footage, and then the drone hits them. And it's just like terror of never feeling safe. That psychological effect that drones can have on people. I would always just be looking in the sky, just scared that I'd be hit at any point in the 24-hour period. The whole time I'd be petrified that going to be here. And that includes, driving in fact, possibly even more so, driving in what you might think is a safe vehicle, whether that be a vehicle like a SUV or an APC. You're just thinking we are now prime targets. The effects drones have on people, I'm sure, cannot be understated. Anyway, moving on. Here is another example of a Russian not too happy with how things are. So he's come from Kamchatka. If you know the game of Risk, you know where that is. He, fairly sure, is on the eastern side of Russia. He complains of no training, a lack of food and ammo, tremendous losses on the left bank. So this is Kherson. Half of his battalion gone. He asked the other Russians not to come to Ukraine. Welcome to Ukraine. So again, I'm not going to go through all of that, but you get the idea that it's not going well for them. Here, the battles are going on every day, he says. It's very difficult to hold the position. Every day, wounded and dead, and then goes on to talk. Sorry, it's just it's not behaving. But you get the idea. This is another first-person testimony of how tough things are for the Russians. Soon we will die. We will start with hunger, he says. All night we just work on. So anyway, let's do this a little bit. They're all munitions, snipers. They have everything: munitions, thermal imagers, quadcopters. They have everything. They see us. They draw us as they can. They take us into captivity. Sniper works very well on thermal imagers. At night we just work on sound, or on noise, on sound. He says. From hunger to, but we are dying a lot here. Soon we will all die. We will start with hunger. From hunger to cold. I appeal to all residents of Kamchatka who are going to the Kamchatka battalion. Do not go. Do not go to this provocation. So he's calling it a provocation. Interesting. And there is a complete mutiny here. The whole army is fully armored, dressed. Yes, the armor is given, but not to everyone. The whole army. And this Archangel is just a SH1T. He is breaking through it specifically. I'm already changing the third armor. Now I find the last one, which is good. I have 3 kits, but he is not broken through. The translation is a bit dodgy. Anyway, you get the idea. Things are not looking good for some of these soldiers on the front line, and Russian soldiers. And the interesting part for me there is that appears to be Kherson that is suffering, and we've heard this a number of times for the Russians. So, Russian instructor of Storm Z penal units explains the impact that Ukrainian cluster munitions is having on Russian infantry, not only killing and wounding them, but also disrupting logistics of evacuation and overfilling the hospitals. He says that wounded Russian servicemen are returned to battle with shrapnel still stuck in their bodies. It's insane, isn't it? So here is the claim. Here we have a certain Wunderwaffe, which, despite all its effectiveness, does not improve the situation at the front due to its limited or even targeted use. Let's say we have a wonderful Smerch system, which in fact does not affect the general state of affairs at the front. These multiple launch rocket systems deliver targeted strikes, but they are simply not enough to provide a full barrage of fire for the advancing infantry. It needs to be scaled up, and then it will have a really tangible effect on the ground, and not just individual use cases suitable for plots of TV programs. And there also are military technological methods that are not only used with a high degree of efficiency, but are also presented in commercial quantities, as a result of which the contours of direct combat operations, rear infrastructure, and military logistics literally break down. Here, in terms of the specific means of destruction available to the enemy, I would highlight 3 elements that radically complicate the situation: HIMARS, kamikaze drones, cluster shells. I would agree with certainly those first 2. I think are game changers, and cluster shells people are arguing over their effectiveness. It is a cluster shells that are now knocking out a huge mass of our infantry with the layering of a number of negative factors. The infantry suffers heavy excess losses directly on the battlefield, as a result of which the execution of combat missions is disrupted, and in addition to this there is an overstrain of evacuation logistics and an overload of the military medical infrastructure. And I showed you that hospital yesterday, footage of inside a kind of is not a purpose-built hospital. I think it had been I don't know what buildings were requisitioned for a hospital, but it was absolutely overcrowded, bunk beds everywhere, and didn't look particularly clean, and there were complaints about the quality of the care they were getting. Anyway, the rapid depletion of infantry units coupled with the overload of hospitals leads to the fact that the people are massively returned to the battle, primarily undertreated and often with small damaging elements in the soft tissues not removed. In addition, as I said above, cluster shells have a very favourable ratio to the quantity used in to the quality of fire damage inflicted on infantry. The general situation at the front, of course, consists of a whole complex of various factors, but weapons like these also have a significant impact on it. It would seem logical to ask the question, well, where is the game change? After all, there are no radical shifts in the front line, much less breakthroughs from the enemy. However, there aren't any on our side either, and there is a price, very high and sad. This is possibly talking to, no, these things haven't changed the game such that you are suddenly seeing a change to mapping. But I wonder whether he's talking about there might be a tipping point at some point where the effect of all these things together combined will get to a point where actually suddenly, and this is what I was talking about previously, there might be a capitulation, there might be a sudden kind of breaking point for the Russians. Now that obviously hasn't been reached yet because they are consistently regenerating forces with, they get, some people are saying 20,000 troops a month. We're going to talk in a little bit, maybe in the next video, about the number of howitzers and self-propelled guns that they're digging out of storage that keeps this war machine going. But at some point, that it is not sustainable if those losses are, the Russian losses are as the general staff claims, and as this guy here, for example, implies. Exhausting and bleeding the enemy on the defensive and then collapsing the front with powerful counterattacks would be an excellent plan if implemented. But in fact, along the way, we ourselves are pretty exhausted and bled dry. Here is a game change in which cluster shells have already played and continue to play their role. Another really challenging state of affairs being communicated there by another Russian soldier. It's not to say that Ukrainians don't have these problems, of course, but we do hear it a lot from the Russians. Now, there's been a spate in Russia of Molotov cocktails being thrown at military enlistment officers. This is in Podolsk. Seen in Podolsk this evening, yet another firebomb attack on a military enlistment office in Russia. Police have already detained a 53-year-old woman. Double glazing saved the office. Only the outer pane broke. So that didn't do any damage particularly. But it's about, what does this say of the general disposition of the Russian public with regard to the continuing war and the potential for a mass mobilization looming. Another arson attack on a military enlistment center. This time, Molotov cocktails lobbed at the army office in Obninsk in the Kaluga region. The video shows the detention of an old man, but he claims he was passing by and tried to put the flames out. Yeah, and there were others too. I mean, I've seen a whole number of these, not particularly successful, but they are happening. And again, what does it tell us? Right, moving on to distant strikes. We'll start with this quote here from Dmitry Pletenchuk from the Ukrainian Navy. So the naval forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces explained the pause in the Russians' use of Caliber cruise missiles to strike targets in Ukraine. Quote, the enemy was forced to relocate its cruise missile carriers to Novorossiysk, but the logistics that serviced these carriers remained in Sevastopol. It's really interesting. So we talk about how the Black Sea Fleet has been functionally defeated in the Black Sea, or at least there's been a huge change in behavior. So they've lost some of their ships and indeed submarine. They've moved out of Sevastopol, which is kind of the whole part. Well, one of the main reasons this war is taking place is for the control of Sevastopol, of Crimea, and the land bridge to Crimea. For Sevastopol, for a warm water deep sea port that the Russian Navy can use. But if they're having to move their navy out of there to a much poorer cousin of a port, so Novorossiysk, which isn't so deep, isn't so protected, they have to moor their ships outside, it doesn't have to dry docks, etc., 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 then that is a massive victory for the Ukrainians. But it's worse than just moving their fleet to there and the port not being as good. The logistics that serve the port of Sevastopol and the other kind of ports around Crimea, if you're moving your ships from there to a port on the Russian mainland, then you have to change and update your logistics. And that includes your delivery and storage of things like cruise missiles. Well, here, the Ukrainian Navy is saying, but the logistics that service these carriers remained in Sevastopol. That's why you see such a big pause in the use of missiles, because now the enemy is faced with the problem of lack of logistics. Interesting. So might not just be this idea that they're stockpiling for a huge attack on Ukraine. There might have already been attacks, but unfortunately, they just don't have the cruise missiles or the provision of cruise missiles to their cruise missile carriers that are now positioned in Novorossiysk. Okay, what happened last night? We had a total of 9 drones being launched, Shahed-type drones, 7 of those being shot down, so fairly good interception rate, but not a huge wave of drones. Don't know of the details of any hits or any damage caused by them. There was a strong explosion in Kherson last night. Preliminary indications were that it was an Iskander ballistic missile, but don't have any news other than that. Today, just pretty much right now, there's a big explosion in Donetsk, that's occupied Donetsk, in the Budnivsky district in the southeast of the city. And Ukraine has previously hit fuel wagons at the railway station there, so I don't know whether that has been what has been struck, whether it's another hit on Russian logistics. There's also, according to Russian media, been drone damages to a Bryansk explosives plant. Now, my opinion is, and I don't know, goodness me, this is just someone sitting in a room in southern England, like banging on. This is truly a chemical plant that makes military explosives, and this is integral in the production of ammunition for the Russian war machine. I'd be hitting this with bleeding every single drone I could get my hands on, not just the odd drone here and there. Oh yeah, we're trying to hit that and trying to. I'd just be wave after wave at this place, and that would strike me as a really important target. Nonetheless, Bryansk chemical plant that produces military explosives and ammunition was damaged by a drone overnight, just a single drone. Anyway, on Friday, Tim White reported a likely drone attack at Kolomna near Moscow. Now, Astra has confirmed that facades and windows were damaged at the Design Bureau of Mechanical Engineering, which is a research or production center that designs and manufactures weapons and military equipment. But that happened on Friday. I think it has also been struck again last night. Yesterday, there were explosions in Kolomna, Moscow region. The Russian media reported on the flight of the Ukrainian drone to the city. I've seen other footage of a drone as well in that area. Breaking, says Peacedale 11. Ukraine again struck near Moscow. The Machino-Stroniya Design Bureau in Kolomna. The Design Bureau is developing missiles and ATGM, among other weapons. 4 days ago, the Bureau was already attacked, so that's what Tim White repeated previously. As a result, the Russian authorities keep a tight ban on reporting. See the print screen from today. Judging by the ambulances and the firefighters at the scene, the attack was certainly successful. There are also reports of Ukrainian attacks in Bryansk, which we talked about, and Tambov region, earlier a gunpowder factory. Again, so I reported on Tambov, that gunpowder factory, a couple of days ago. These are exactly the sorts of targets that you would want to hit. This is a Russian source saying, in fact, there is a criminal liability for this sitting in chat. So the idea is don't spread it. Ukraine have done this pretty much as well. You can't report on strikes within Ukraine. If you're Ukrainian, you can't share photos. You're not supposed to. And someone says, what information did we provide? That a drone fell again and explosives were heard again in Bochmanovo. Some information is secret. There, ambulances and firefighters from all over the city caught up there without you. The whole city sees and hears. And do you really think that in the city there are no these devils who, without telegram, leak all the information to the Ukrainians? Let's just pretend that nothing is happening. Let's say that the gas explosion exploded in the middle of Bochmanovo. Google Translate is a bit dodgy again, but you get the idea that here's someone saying, really, are we going to keep this quiet? Explosions going on in our city, and you think it's not going to leak to telegram? And of course it does. Right, moving on to other bits and pieces, and I reported on Russian army drug usage in an extra segment some time back. But the UK intelligence update says that almost 1 in 6 Russian invaders in Ukraine is a druggie, according to Tim White. So in a September 2023, that was Tim, wasn't it? Yeah. In September 2023, says the UK intelligence, independent Russian media outlet Vertska reported that up to 15% of Russian soldiers in Ukraine were using drugs, including amphetamines and cannabis, and that they were easy to obtain even on the front line. These reports are credible and follow numerous reports since the invasion of a high rate of disciplinary incidents, crimes and deaths related to alcohol abuse amongst the Russian force. Russian commanders likely frequently punish drug and alcohol abusers by posting them Storm Z assault detachments, which have effectively become penal units. One of the core drivers of poor Russian discipline and substance abuse likely remains the continued lack of opportunity for combat troops to rotate away from the front line. I was listening to Gustav Gressel on Silicon Curtain, a really good interview, and I'm trying to get. I really want to interview him, so I've reached out to him. But if anyone can ask Gustav Gressel if he can come on to my channel, that'd be fabulous. Really interesting part of the conversation was about how Russian troops don't go back to Russia. So when they are rotated, they have to, like, air quotes, holiday. You know, they take their time out in the occupied territories where they are, or at most in Belarus. They don't go home. He said that actually, the longer the war goes on, I was sort of talking about this yesterday with regard to Putin wants the war to continue. It's in his best interest that it continues for him personally, that kind of existential link to the outcome of the war. But also, if the war ends, you will get so many veterans coming back and coming into society with all their bad experiences and all their commanders were bad, we were treated poorly, we weren't paid, all their complaints, and probably complaints about the whole war effort and the decision to go to war. At least some of those people will be coming back and causing all sorts of problems back at home. But actually, the Russians are working to, keep them all in Ukraine. So the general public in Russia just don't have, yes, they get phone conversations with family members and whatnot, but there isn't that infiltration of these experiences in Ukraine with Russian soldiers, assimilating into and throughout Russian society. A really interesting point that he made there. And, when they're injured, they're pretty much sent straight back to the front line. It's almost like, right, now you're in a war, you have nothing to do with Russian society for as long as this war goes on. You keep hearing that is the case, that they're in that for the long haul. Right, Defense Ministry is considering, so this is the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, considering the potential dismissal of 3 commanders within Ukraine's armed forces. Probably people whose names I've mentioned a number of times, who knows. Ukrainian media outlet Ukrainska Pravda reported on the 13th, yesterday, citing unnamed sources in the country's military and political leadership. Well, the Kyiv Independent later then says, Defense Ministry reacts to reports on potential dismissal of 3 military commanders following a report by Ukrainska Pravda alleging the Defense Ministry was considering the dismissal of 3 military commanders. The ministry issued a statement saying that, quote, the information published by a number of outlets is not true. The ministry didn't specify the media or what the statement was referring to. Quote, the Defense Ministry does not comment on rumours or unverified information. Everyone works as usual and decisions are discussed in coordination with the General Staff. So it may or may not happen. There could be a clearing out of some of the key decision makers. We shall see. And then this doesn't surprise me, though. It sounds like pretty phenomenal. The SBU is investigating 8,000 cases of suspected treason. The SBU told New Voice that it initiated over 7,000 investigations, holy cow, in criminal proceedings related to Article 111-1 of the Criminal Code and nearly 1,000 under Article 111-2. Now, I don't report, but I could do every day on arrests of people, and you see them, their faces blurred out. This person being arrested for spotting for Russian artillery. This person is being arrested for giving them information for a missile strike on, say, Kramatorsk or whatever it is, some of these big ones as well. And this is happening all the time. And so it doesn't surprise me that there's many investigations, especially when you consider that, you've got Donbass, you've got the DPR, you've got the LPR, you've got a lot of Russian sentiment in a country that went to war, and you would have had pro-Russian people throughout Ukraine, obviously particularly in the east, but throughout Ukraine, who would then be working for the Russian authorities, really, even if it's in some sort of relatively minor way, that it doesn't surprise me that you'd have this many investigations going on and this many people suspected of treason, uh, because that's the nature of the beast of this of Ukraine and its history with Russia and Russia invading. There would have been, certainly at the beginning of the war, a lot of sympathy for Russia amongst certain demographic of the population. Anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.